Today we're reviewing the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X. It's a 12-core, 24-thread part. Yesterday we reviewed the 9950X. It's the 16-core counterpart. And before that, we did the 9700X. That's the 8-core. The last one that'll remain will be the 9600X for this review's roundup. So this CPU has a current price of $500. It's flanked by the 9950X at $650 and the 9700X at $360. The 9600X is $280 right now. So the competing CPUs for the 9900X include AMD's own alternatives. The 7800X3D for gaming is a $366 CPU right now. It's about the same as the 9700X in price. The 7700 non-X is $290. The R9 7950X 16-core CPU is $525, and the 7900X predecessor is $359. The 9900X's closest competition at $500, we think, would be AMD's own 7950X for core-intensive workloads, or Intel's 14700K at $400 and cheaper. The 14900K is $546 or so right now, and the 14700K will, in a lot of cases, be a direct alternative pending results of ongoing Intel microcode and customer support issues and investigations. As we're 3 videos deep in the Zen saga right now for Zen 5, we're going to focus on the product level for this, look at it from a pure review standpoint. If you want some more background of the architecture, there's a separate video for that. The efficiency, there's a whole 40-minute deep dive on that, which is really worth looking at, by the way. That one got a little buried by our 9950X review. But here we're just going to focus on product level and what we always focus on, which is value. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Aeronaut and Hydronaut thermal pastes. Aeronaut is Thermal Grizzly's entry-level thermal solution, marketed as resistant to curing and for long-term endurance. Hydronaut is Thermal Grizzly's next step up, targeted for overclocking and higher performance applications. We've used Hydronaut on a lot of our systems internally over the years. You can learn more at the link in the description below. So as we start this one, we're going to put a quick list of tests that we conduct for these reviews to help people jump around. There's a lot in here. I know people jump around in the reviews to find what's relevant to you. Totally fine with me, by the way. Save your time. There's timestamps in the description if any of these in this list interest you specifically. So the 9900X review and the 9950X review both contain more production benchmarks than gaming. This is because gaming is well represented in our 9700X review, but also because for these CPUs, we really believe that the only real reason to test them in gaming is to ensure that they aren't really screwed in some way. Make sure they work properly. The gaming benchmarks are basically just to validate that there are no major unforeseen issues, no major regressions as a result of the core count. This is something that used to happen, but it seems like we're past those days. And once they pass that barrier of working properly, we move on. We also have a list of unused tests. You can see those now. These are tests which we've conducted, but which we haven't put in the review for one reason or another. Those reasons span from already being represented, such as by other games or by multiples, duplicates of something like 7-zip, up to reasons like we just eliminated it because we couldn't validate the results. We thought maybe there was something screwy with the way that particular benchmark works, or because we are still validating it, meaning that those are experimental tests which are not yet ready for prime time. We haven't fully gone through the methodology. We're not completely confident in the results yet. So anything that says still validating meets that definition. And normally we don't tell people what we're validating and what we're still vetting, but we've decided to start doing that just so you have a roadmap for what we're kind of eliminating or what we're potentially adding. As a reminder, we have over 50 CPUs benchmarked right now in our newest suite. We started rolling this out just in July, so it's a ton of CPUs for a short window. And we frequently have 20 to 30 on the charts here. Each of those CPUs undergoes multiple test passes per benchmark. So there are over, I don't know, at least 4,000 average data points that we've collected in the last month for all these tests. These test suites currently require a few days of testing and analysis per CPU. So we're trying to continually add tests for the audience. We're keeping an eye on comments for further requests, and we're also eliminating tests which are redundant or potentially not useful. And as one other quick update, this is our current list of games and the release dates for our test suite. We fully updated this last month to move mostly to 2023 or 2024 games, with a few exceptions where we wanted something unique represented, like Stellaris for simulation time. So that should get you all pretty caught up to speed with what we've been working on. Major overhaul, especially on the games where everything we're using is basically a brand new game the last 2 years now, which is why we've been publishing those standalone game research pieces. So really cool to integrate all that. And we're still keeping an eye out for comments for further requests, so you can leave them below. Just when you make a request, we see every now and then someone will post something as an example. Could you do some music production testing? We'd be happy to. If you don't mind, if you have an idea for one, please tell us specifically what software. That would give us a good starting point, because music production testing, as just an example, it could be interesting. We don't know anything about it. We could run a test, but we need someone to point us in a direction of, hey, this is what we'd like to see tested, and then my team can start investigating that with me. All right, so one more note. We know there's a new line of commentary about Windows and administrative permissions relating to CPUs in general. I guess it wasn't just Zen 5, but also Zen 4 from what I understand right now. Hardware Unboxed talked about that briefly in a new video, and basically the way we're looking at this is our testing is applied equally to all devices. It's tested the same way on all devices. Make a Windows account. Don't run everything at elevated permissions because that's actually insane from a security standpoint, and then we test the stuff. So if AMD or Microsoft make changes to the way that these or other CPUs behave with Windows, scheduling, thread management, or permissions, things like that, then we'll test at that time to look at those new changes. However, for now, we test the user experience. That is part of the user experience, and we haven't made an exception for anyone else, for Intel or any prior architecture, so we're not going to do it now because the way we test is user experience. All core frequency starts us off to validate that the CPU is performing as expected. To first reestablish the other recent numbers, the 9700X with all threads rendering averaged 4440 to 4480 megahertz all core, mostly limited by its power budget. The 9950 measured around 5000 megahertz commonly. This was a big jump from the 9700X and is enabled by that higher power budget. The 9900X that we're reviewing today plots above all of these so far, typically in the range of 5200 to 5300 megahertz. It seems to be striking a balance between the core count and a higher frequency. The CPU has a higher power budget than the 9700X, but less than the 9950X, but it also has fewer cores than the 9950X, which benefits its boosting. For reference, here's the 7900X. This one runs around 5150 megahertz all core, so reduced from the 9900X. That'll be good news for the new 9900X, as it's both lower power and higher frequency than the 7900X. The 7900X's TDP matches that of the 9950X. Finally, the 7900 non-X runs around the levels of the 9700X, just with more drops in frequency from bouncing off of the barrier more. This is a 65-watt TDP part, so the behavior is expected. Single-core frequency boosting is next with Cinebench single-threaded. This plots the maximum frequency of any single core during the interval. The 9700X started this generation at 5525 MHz single-core, followed by our 9950X review with a slightly more variable result of around 5700 MHz, with some peaks to 5725. This keeps up the tradition of holding a high frequency on modern Zen architectures and is what enabled the 9950X to pull ahead in some modern gaming tests. The 9900X holds 5625 MHz single core, right between the other two that we've reviewed so far. The prior R9 7900X ran a higher single core frequency of 5700 MHz and is benefited here by its higher power budget. So expect to see some back and forth with the 9900X in scenarios where only a few threads are loaded. This may be the case in gaming, where sometimes the higher frequency can claw back ground. It'll depend on architectural improvements, IPC, and ultimately how much AMD is getting done per clock with the Zen 5 architectural upfits. Finally, the 7900 maxed out a flatline 5450 MHz below everything. We'll briefly look at thermal results with the same all-core workload. We're using a Liquid Freezer 2 360 at 100% fan speeds for all of this testing. We try to emphasize this one point. So temperature is ultimately a manifestation of the power that we push through a chip, just as measured on a sensor somewhere within the chip. And it's normally lots of sensors, and it either averages them or produces the maximum result in a given area. This is one of the results that produces the most confusion and misinformation within the PC hardware space. Indirectly, power ends up being the most useful for figuring out how hot a CPU is going to be. Temperature itself can be a tough metric to use when basing off of internal CPU sensors because they're not always comparable. We frequently see users comparing Intel and AMD CPU thermals all the time. You really can't directly compare them. It'd make more sense to compare the power draw head-to-head, not necessarily the thermals. The thermal sensors are in different places, and in fact, just this generation, we talked about in the 9700X review how AMD said it moved its T-die sensor in a way that makes the 7000 series cooler. It's not directly comparable to the 9000 series. We talked about that in our 9700X review. Anyway, here's the chart for this one. This is with the same liquid cooler, and it's all Zen 5, so these are directly comparable. The 9700X and 9600X are the lowest power of these. The 9700X ends up cooler on T-die than the 9600X, and that much is like for like, because it has more cores to spread the same power and heat across. The 9700X ran at about 51 degrees Celsius in a 21 to 22C test environment. The 9600X ran at 58 degrees with the same controlled conditions and at steady state. The 9900X ran at 70 degrees Celsius with the 9950X at 81 degrees Celsius. Under identical conditions, we generally advise a 360mm liquid cooler for a 9950X based on this, if you want some room to drop your fan speeds for lower noise levels. The 9900X would do fine with a high-end air cooler or a 280mm liquid cooler. The 9700X and the 9600X can use any number of affordable air coolers on the market, and you can check our cooler reviews for numbers on all of that. In worst case peak power consumption loading where all cores are engaged with rendering, the 9900X pulled 176 watts of EPS 12-volt cables. The 7900X that it sort of replaces required 13% more power at 199 watts, so AMD has definitely improved in all-core power consumption for workloads like this. Here's some generational comparisons. The 5900X pulled 133 watts in the same test, and the 3900X pulled 150 watts. The 5000 series is when AMD really dropped power consumption in big ways and seemed to have a 12 and 16 core CPU correlation with better voltage bins. The 7950X required 251 watts in this test, with the 9950X improving to 223 watts in this measurement. We talked about that in yesterday's video. Overall, this is an area where AMD has been improving in total power consumption, despite setbacks in gaming power efficiency and sometimes gaming total power draw that we looked at in our video from a couple days ago. Also, just for fun, we threw Intel's 9900 down here as well, except it's the 9900K from 2018, and it pulled 94 watts, at least after 5 minutes. If you tested the first 54 seconds or so, it would be much higher, but that was from its Tau period. The company also had a 9900X. It did seem extreme, though, to buy a 6-year-old CPU for a joke, so we'll move on. Power efficiency is up now. We'll start with the best case scenario that relates to the prior power consumption chart, which is rendering. For this one, factoring in total render time in Blender for a frame of our GN logo animation, the 9900X ranked at 22.6 watt-hours. That puts it about equal with the 9950X, so it's overall more efficient than the 7900X, which had a 29.9 watt-hour result. The improvement here is huge, as we've seen consistently in this test. We're seeing a reduction of 24% in watt-hours used during the testing, with comparable improvements from the 7950X to the 9950X that we looked at yesterday. The 9700X kicked all this off by achieving the top score for an out-of-the-box CPU at 19.2 watt-hours, behind only the 7950X in Eco Mode and the PPT Limited demo tests. This was a big improvement on both the same TDP 7700 and the higher TDP 7700X, so Zen 5 is looking good in this comparison. The 9900X continues the trend of improving on efficiency in this all-core scenario. Next is efficiency with 7-zip. We're looking at millions of instructions per second per watt of compression. This could be simplified to millions of instructions per joule. However, like we said previously, we ran a poll on the YouTube community page, and 80% of people voted for per watt metrics rather than the simplified metrics. So we're going to go with the democratic approach and choose that. The R9 9900X completed 1,041 MIPS per watt. This has it equal to the 7600X for efficiency. The 9950X completed 1,003, so it's a little less efficient than the 9900X, and it pulled 204 watts during the testing. 7800X3D is remarkably efficient here, with the 7700 also doing pretty well. We don't see the same gains scaling here from the Blender test, and the Zen 5 CPUs are overall less efficient than their preceding counterparts when analyzing compression, which partly has to do with limited ability to continue pushing the performance higher, since efficiency is a metric that includes performance. We're adding decompression to efficiency now as well. It's a first for this suite, which is about the same power consumption and should help demystify some of the performance. So with decompression now, at the same power consumption in these tests, this gives the 9950X incredible performance in just raw MIPS, so that'll help it in MIPS per watt. The 9950X ends up at the top of the cluster that's behind the 5700X3D. The 9700X does relatively well here, up at 1662 MIPS per watt. It's still behind the R7 7700 with the same TDP, and both are behind the impressively low power 7800X3D. The 7800X3D's ability to operate at only 70 watts here is what lets it lead charts so easily. This is also a matter of voltage bin for each CPU. That's a topic we talked about in our video from a few days ago on Zen 5 efficiency. The new 9900X that we're reviewing ends up in the middle. It's about the same efficiency as the 5600X and the 9600X. It's not distant from the 9950X, and it's notably better than the 7700X and obviously below. Intel CPUs bombed this test thanks to their extremely high power consumption. We'll look at gaming efficiency now, starting with Stellaris. In Stellaris simulation time, the 9900X ranked at 1.5 simulations per watt hour. Predictably, it's less efficient in gaming workloads than the 9600X at 1.9 sims per watt hour and the 9700X at 1.8 sims per watt hour. The 9900X pulls a little more power, but isn't intended to outrun the R5 and R7 CPUs in gaming, and so it's ranked instead alongside the 9950X. This is expected behavior. The 9900X and 9950X are really only meant to be capable of gaming, not meant to excel at it and outperform AMD's other CPUs. The 7800X2D is once again a feat of engineering and productization, hitting its stride with a 3.0 simulations per watt hour score. Intel CPUs mostly cluster around a 1.0 scoring, with the 14600K finding a much better balance at 1.5. Phantom Liberty had the 9900X at about 105 watts during the test, which landed it at around 1.6 FPS per watt. That ranking has it functionally tied with the 9950X, which pulled 119 watts here, and the 5800X, which pulled 90. The 9700X is a better balance for Zen 5, up at 2.2 FPS per watt. The 9700X, however, is tied with the 7700 non-X and outperformed by the preceding R5 CPUs and the X3D CPUs. We don't have Intel numbers on this chart yet. Final Fantasy Dawntrail had the 9900X at 4.3 FPS per watt, which aligns it with the 9700X and 14600K. AMD's architecture is still more efficient than Intel's for out-of-box settings here, but it has defeated itself with some of its past CPU choices. As we said in the 9950X review, we're focusing the 12-core and 16-core reviews on production workloads, because these CPUs are more likely to be used in those tests. We still test gaming, but it's only to make sure things work properly. We'll focus on non-gaming scenarios. So for these mini HEDT parts, as we like to call them, we'll be running the first batch on production. First up is Rodinia CFD, which we're adding after working with Wendell from Level 1 Techs, a neutral third party, and AMD to validate our findings. We had to get their external help validating our findings before publishing this chart because the numbers were so distant from the other charts, and we always want to make sure any outliers are confirmed valid test results. In seeking peer review, we were able to confirm the findings between the 7950X here and the 9950X, where the 9950X posted an uncharacteristically large 28 to 29% uplift over the 7950X in this computational fluid dynamics situation. This was confirmed, again, by both Level 1 and AMD, both of whom sent us their own results for validation. The 9900X sees a smaller uplift, closer to 10% over the 7900X here, but consider that it's a 50 watt lower advertised TDP. This would be another situation where Zen 5 CPUs may offer better efficiency and also better performance. We have not tested the efficiency in this application yet. We'll talk about this chart in more detail in our upcoming hardware news episode, but we wanted to shove it in here since it's an interesting one. The 9950X does phenomenally as compared to the other 21 tests or so we ran on it. The 9900X is also in good standing when considering the power drop. This is part of the spec workstation suite that we've been slowly rolling out. We'll add more as we continue to validate the findings and make sure everything tests to our quality standards. Just as one note, this chart is not 100% confirmed yet. It is still what we consider an experimental test, so we're leaving some room here for changes in the event we find something related to the benchmark software or how it's executing that drops below our standards in the future. But we did want to share this just because we think it's an important data point, and we did some basic peer review with it, and our numbers aligned with theirs. Rendering in Blender is up first. For this, the 9900X completed the work in 7.7 minutes. That has it just ahead of the 14900K's 7.9 minute result for our intro animation, and benefiting from a 14% reduction in time required from the 7900X's 9-minute result. The 7900 is slower still at 10.6 minutes, with the 9700X at 13.2 minutes. That allows the 9900X a render time requirement reduction of 43% against the 9700X, which makes sense with the core count increase. Generationally, the 5900X required 12.4 minutes, giving the 9900X a reduction of 38% in total render time for this one frame. The 9950X and the 7950X both lead the 9900X, with the 9950X offering a render time reduction of 23% total time required. If you're debating whether the extra cost is worth it, that should help form a decision. Up next is Chromium Code Compile. As with all tests, a single benchmark of a workload can only truly represent that workload. This is what we use for compile testing right now. Other compile workloads can and do differ. The 9900X required 80 minutes to complete this code compile, which has it tied with the 14700K. The 9950X completed the compile with a total time reduction of 17.6% with its 66-minute result, with the 7950X leading the 9900X with a reduction in total time of 8.5%. The 7900X required 87 minutes for this work, giving the 9900X a 7.7% time reduction. That gap grows with the 7900 non-X and its lower power budget. Generationally, the most interesting improvement is the 33% time requirement reduction against the 5900X, dropping from 120 minutes to 80 minutes. The only Intel CPU ahead of the 9900X is the i9 lineup, so that'd be the 14900K and the 3900K options. In 7-zip file compression, the 9900X completed 168.9 thousand MIPS, landing it between the 7900X, 3.5% improved, and the 14700K itself, 3.4% ahead of the 9900X. The 14700K looks to be the direct competition to the 9900X in some of these, assuming Intel resolves its issues without any collateral damage. There aren't many upgrade options without going to true HEDT. The 9950X would grant a further uplift of 21% in MIPS, just ahead of the 7950X. The 14900K at 188,000 MIPS would improve about 11%. Generationally, the jump over the 5900X is large. The 9900X moves to 168,992 from the 5900X's 123,278 MIPS. In file decompression, the 9900X completed 217.5 thousand MIPS and landed between the 13900K and the 14900K CPUs. It's actually below the 5950X here, so we're seeing more benefit from just raw core count in this particular benchmark decompression than some others. Another example is the 5800X outperforming the 7600X, or the 3950X outmatching the 5900X, which is just the prior generation representation of kind of what we're seeing now. The 9950X and the 7950X set a high ceiling in this test, with the 9950X leading the 9900X by 29%. The 14700K remains a good competitor, but it allows the 9900X to gain a lead of 8% in this benchmark. In Adobe Photoshop with the Puget Suite, the 9900X's completion of filters, scales, warps, blend modes, blend layers, and other functions gave it a score of 11,385 points. That ties it with the 9950X, where both see a slight loss in performance compared to the 9700X. This test is a little more thread limited and doesn't benefit as much from the huge core count increases, unlike what we just saw in decompression. That's okay. That's why we run so many tests. It allows us to show all different types of software scenarios. They're all realistic environments. The 9900X still does well if this is a side task you might do in your machine, ultimately remaining among the top CPUs here. In this test right now, the Intel CPUs fall below a quarter of the total entries we have, which are AMD. This appears to have shifted from an Intel favor in years past to an AMD favor today. Adobe Premiere is next, also in the Puget Suite. In this one, the 9900X scored 10,380 points, again roughly tying it with the 14700K. In Premiere testing with the extended workload, the 9950X pulls ahead by 5.5%. There's not a big benefit to the cores here, but the lineup makes a little more sense than in Photoshop. The 9900X outdoes the 7900X only marginally at 2.8% total uplift. The lead over the 5900X prior CPU, or well, two prior generations, is 26%. Spec Workstation is up now. This first test is the financial simulations like probability calculations, options modeling, and similar tests. This is a workstation task scored in aggregate. The 9900X scored 7.27 points in open spec testing, which improves it upon the 7900X by 8.8%. The 9950X leads this chart currently, at least until we run Threadripper through again, at 9.47, which is a 30% uplift over the 9900X. Intel's 14700K trails the 9900X here, with the 14900K ahead of it. The next spec test is for LAMMPS Biomedical modeling. In this benchmark, the 9900X scored 6.06, which ranked it as tied with the 13700K. The 14700K leads by 8%. If you're considering the 9900X versus the 9950X, then the improvement here of the 9950X would be about 14.4%. Uplift over the 7900X for the 9900X is 4.5% here. Not bad since the power also went down. We'll keep the gaming test short for this one, just like we did for the 9950X. The goal is to mostly verify that it works properly. The 7800X3D will predictably remain the top choice for new gaming machines, with closest competition from maybe a 14900K, as soon as Intel gets its stuff together. Here's the list of games we've been testing this time around. We made it a huge point to undergo a massive overhaul for our gaming benchmarks, so most of what we use now is from 2023 and 2024. This has actually been pretty awesome to get some of the newer games in here. They're really starting to scale with core counts at 8 and above as well. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up first, a 2024 title. In Dragon's Dogma 2, the 9900X ran at 90 FPS average with lowest space proportionally, based on neighboring results. Cores are parked for the 9900X and 9950X, so they're basically 9700X CPUs in terms of core count, just with a higher power budget. This has the 9950X ahead of the 9700X as a result, for reasons we showed in our 9950X review. The 93 FPS average result is a repeatable but small advantage. The 9900X is tied with the 9700X and 7700X. Uplift over the 7900X for the 9900X is 2.7%. As before, the leader remains the 78X3D. In a gaming scenario, you can expect an uplift in our custom testing in the big city here, amounting to about 21% for the 7800X3D over the 9900X. The 14900K is also up top, but technically behind the 7800X3D. The 14700K that the 9900X was neck and neck with in many production tests is also shown favorable gaming performance here. F124 is another 2024 title, clearly, and has the 9900X at 383 FPS average, just ahead of the 9700X and behind the 9950X. These three CPUs are functionally about the same. The 14900K lands alongside them. Chart leaders include not only the 7800X3D, but also the 2-generation-old 5800X3D CPU at 400 FPS average, which is incredible for a CPU on the AM4 platform. Just how powerful those CPUs were and remain today. Goated CPUs aside, the 9900X is at least running properly and without a performance sacrifice, which is a big improvement over what we saw many years ago with early 16-core AMD CPUs, like the 1950X. In Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, the 9900X ran at about 333 FPS average, which roughly ties it with the 9700X and 5600X3D. The 5600X3D is enough alone to demonstrate that there are clearly better value gaming parts for pure gaming builds, as we've been saying, but it doesn't scale anywhere close to the levels of something like a 9900X in the production strengths that we saw earlier. So it all depends on your use case. If you're doing a lot of work on your machine and that work is similar to the applications we've tested, it still makes more sense to go this route if it's going to make you money or impact your job somehow. The 7800X3D sets the ceiling at 363 FPS average in this one. The 9950X leads the 9900X on a technicality. The 7900 underperforms here. Its 65 watt TDP is limiting its power availability to boost. And so the 7700 non-X at the same TDP is better able to leverage that power budget across fewer cores to boost higher, which Dawntrail favors. Stellaris Simulation Time is next. Despite being among the oldest two games in our bench suite and the only ones that predate 2022, Stellaris remains remarkable as we test simulation time rather than frame rate. The 9950X required on average 30 seconds to complete the simulation. Leaders here remain the 9700X, 9950X, and then 7800X3D. Some of these are within error of each other. The 14900K entries are both near the 9900X, though it has a technical lead over the 14900K with the standardized RAM we use, and the 14700K, the two of which are within run-to-run variants of each other. Improvement over the 7900X is about 10% less time to simulate here. Baldur's Gate 3 is last for games. Tested at 1080p, we found the 9900X to run at 104 FPS average, which is 2.9% ahead of the R9 7900 and exactly equal with the 7900X for average. There's no improvement in this situation. We have other games tested, but we'll stop there. The performance is basically the same. It scales the same way in all the games, so the pattern persists, and there's no reason to just show more of them. All right, so for the 7900X versus the 9900X, performance across the board illustrates improvements in the range of 0% to 10%, depending on the use case. We're not seeing a lot of regression here, so that's at least a positive, as opposed to, say, the 9700X. Production applications commonly see 3 to 7% uplift. Some of them are at 9 to 12%. Efficiency was explored in our deep dive a few days ago. It'd be great if you go check it out. That video got a little bit buried algorithmically when we posted our 9950X review because it was so close to the efficiency one. So we want to make sure that everyone's aware it exists. You'll get a deep dive on the topic of efficiency there, and it is not what people necessarily expected initially. Broadly speaking, currently it makes more sense to buy AMD's previous generation CPUs to us. The 14700K is also worth consideration. However, we're still on pause for our recommendations of Intel pending exploratory testing of its new microcode and support processes. There are a lot of angles to look at and evaluate a new product. There's a lot of use cases for them. For us, we look at it from a consumer standpoint, and that particular angle for us means value. So we're not just looking at gaming. We do have games tested, but actually in the 9950X review and in this one, we have more of what we call production applications tested, with some new stuff coming in from SpecWS. So this time that included the financial services modeling, where it does pricing and options predictions, things like that, Black-Scholes modeling, stuff of that nature, and also the biomedical angle. So we've got a good amount of tests in here. And even with those tests, not just gaming, but also including it, from a value standpoint, we think that Zen 4 currently is a better value. And that's looking at it from a money to performance angle. Now, with efficiency, it's comparable in a lot of cases. Sometimes Zen 5 can be slightly worse. It depends on the application, especially if the power's gone up. And then sometimes it can be a lot better. It really depends on the workload. AVX512 is a part of that, but so is whether it's fully loaded on all the threads or not. Now, we're aware also that in some heavy number crunching workloads, especially with AVX512, in Linux testing recently in particular, there is bigger uplift for some of the Zen 5 versus Zen 4 comparisons. However, for our testing in Windows with the suite that we've used, we don't really see that behavior. So it's definitely a thing that can happen. It is not a thing that happens in our test suite with maybe 1 to 2 exceptions, one of them being Blender with that 14% uplift for this particular CPU, and then massive efficiency improvements, again, in Blender, which is an all-core workload. So as a consumer-oriented review outlet with a focus on value, our recommendations would be currently Zen 4 alternatives. So this includes the 7950X for core-bound workloads. Pricing's gotten pretty competitive there, 16-core CPU. If your workloads don't use those extra 4 cores over a 12, then maybe it makes less sense. But a lot of the time, if it's going to use 12, it'll use 16. So we'd recommend looking at the 7950X. Its price is extremely competitive with Zen 5. And then the 7800X3D is still the best for gaming-focused builds. The 14700K is pretty competitive in many cases with the 9900X. However, again, we are currently undertaking a full test of Intel's microcode, and we have paused recommendations of any Intel 13th and 14th generation CPUs as a result of a combination of both Intel's reaction and response to the problems and the uncertainty around how the microcode long-term may affect things. So we're still paused there, but the 14700K should at least be on your radar. So that's going to be it for this one. Pretty fun working on these. There's one big one left, which is the 9600X. We had to go back and do that one because we were waiting for a functioning CPU to arrive for us to test. We have had one, and that'll be the next one we do. Otherwise, we're looking at cases, coolers, pre-built systems, stuff like that for reviews coming up, and then some more investigations. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, subscribe for more to catch the 9600X review. Go check out that Zen 5 efficiency piece if you don't mind, because I loved working on it. It was super educational for our team, really fun to do, and I knew it was going to happen, but we posted it and it was exploding for view count. And then we had to drop the 9950X review when that embargo lifted, and it just kind of truncated it. So just want people to be aware that's out there if you're interested in that angle. So thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our silicone soldering and project mats. We have brand new colors up there, green, red, and yellow joining blue. And you can use code THISISFINE for 10% off anything on the store while that code is active. If you want to grab a mod mat shirt or something else, pick it up there. It supports our testing directly. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.